On behalf of the Stanford administration, I welcome you tonight to the Mimi and Peter Haas Distinguished Visitor Lecture. I would like to give a special thanks to Mimi Haas for her vision and leadership in working with us to establish the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor Program that brings visionary global leaders for a 10-week residency to engage with students, faculty, and our larger Stanford campus community. Thank you to the Haas Center for Public Service for hosting and for the more than 30 campus departments, centers, and organizations for co-sponsoring tonight's event focused on public service and the university. Dr. Beverly Tatum arrives on campus as we're experiencing through Cardinal Service Initiative the boldest expansion of the commitment to service at Stanford since the Haas Center was founded some 30 years ago. Cardinal Service is part of Stanford's work to consider deeply new approaches to ethical and effective service. It is a key part of redefining education at Stanford and is helping spur a civic resurgence in universities nationally. If there is someone who understands the significance of public service in higher education, it is Dr. Beverly Tatum. Dr. Tatum served as president of Spelman College from 2002 to 2015, a time of significant growth and innovation at that institution. During her tenure, scholarship support for Spelman students tripled and opportunities for faculty research and development expanded significantly. She has received numerous awards, including the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award and the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. She holds a BA from Wesleyan University and an MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, as well as an MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Dr. Tatum is widely recognized as a race relations expert and a leader in higher education. Her areas of research include racial identity development and the role of race in the classroom. Her students at Stanford and elsewhere, faculty and staff alike, I should add, have mentioned that her books have been transformative in their lives. Her books include Assimilation Blues, Black Families in White Community, and Can We Talk About Race? And Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, And this year marks the 20th anniversary of the publication of her seminal book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. An updated edition of this bestseller will be released this fall, and we're hoping to get a sneak preview tonight. We are thrilled and honored to have Beverly Tatum in residence at the Haas Center for the spring quarter, along with her husband, Dr. Travis Tatum, who's down here. He's a professor emeritus of education. They have arrived here during a historic moment for our country, one in which we must confront profound and challenging questions about our national identity and values, who we are as a country, and who we will become. It is moments like these when scholarship and informed civil discourse become even more valuable. And we are deeply grateful for Dr. Tatum for her insight and inspiration. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished 2017 Haas visitor, Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just say I am completely honored to be here as the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor at the Haas Center for Public Service, and I certainly want to thank Dr. Elam for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank the Haas staff for making me feel so welcome, me and my husband, Travis, and a special thank you to Mimi Haas, who is here tonight, for making this opportunity so possible. Thank you so much. When people ask me what I've been doing since I left the presidency of Spelman College, I tell them that I'm working on, as you heard, the 20th anniversary edition of that book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. And the typical response when I tell them that comes in the form of a question, or sometimes two. The first question, is that still happening? And then, are things getting any better? A quick glance across the cafeteria in the average racially mixed U.S. high school or college will tell you that the answer to the first question is yes. And you knew that, I could tell by the laughter. But what, if anything, does that tell us about the answer to the second question? Are things getting better? What does better look like? That is a more complicated question. What has changed for better or worse in the last 20 years? And what is the implication for how we understand ourselves and each other in reference to our racial identities? And if we're dissatisfied with the way things are, what can we do to change it? I wrote the first version of this book in 1996. It was published in 97, but I was writing in what I thought of, certainly, as the closing years of the 20th century. Now, almost 2 decades into the 21st, it seems we are still struggling with what W.E.B. Du Bois identified in 1906 as the problem of the color line, even though the demographic composition of that color line has changed quite a bit since then. The numbers are pretty remarkable when you consider that in 1950, the total U.S. population was nearly 90% white. Fast forward to 2014, it was the first time in U.S. history that the majority of elementary and secondary school children were of color: Black, Latino, Asian, or Native. As I like to say, new faces, same places. Today, Latinos are the largest population of color in the nation, almost 18%. The Black population is at 13%. Asians are 6%, but growing in population size faster than any other group, largely the result of immigration. The percentage of multiracial babies has risen from 1% in 1970 to 10% in 2013. Despite the fact that our national diversity is growing rapidly, old patterns of segregation persist, most notably in schools and neighborhoods. More than 60 years after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, in every region of the country except the West, our public schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980, with the highest rates of school segregation occurring in the Northeast. Nationwide, nearly 75% of Black students today attend so-called majority-minority schools. Similarly, large numbers of Hispanic students, approximately 80%, attend schools where students of color are in the majority. Both Black and Latino students are much more likely than white students to attend a school where 60% or more of their classmates are living in poverty, as measured by the percentage of students eligible for free or reduced-price lunch programs. Separate remains unequal, as schools with concentrated poverty and racial segregation are still likely to have less experienced teachers, high levels of teacher turnover, inadequate facilities, and fewer classroom resources. Neighborhood schools have once again become the predominant method of student assignment, and to the extent that neighborhoods are segregated, the schools remain so. When we talk about residential segregation, we inevitably find that we are talking not only about race, but also class. Certainly, income matters when you're looking for housing, but we can't overlook the way housing patterns have been shaped historically by race-based policies and practices such as racially restrictive real estate covenants, racial steering by real estate agents, redlining of neighborhoods, and other discriminatory practices by mortgage lenders. That history includes the use by many white homeowners associations of physical threats and violence to keep unwanted people of color out of their neighborhoods. The legacy of these policies and practices lives on in the present as past housing options enhance or impede the accumulation of home equity and eventually the intergenerational transmission of wealth. And though such policies are now illegal at the federal, state, and local level, evidence suggests they haven't been eliminated in practice. Contemporary surveys of racial attitudes among whites indicates that the larger the hypothetical Black population is, the more likely white respondents are to express discomfort about living in the same neighborhood. The behavioral result of such attitudes is that progress toward residential integration has been quite limited. Of all groups of color, Asian Americans are the least segregated from whites, meaning they're the most likely to live in white neighborhoods. But not surprisingly, of all racial groups, whites are the most isolated. They are the most likely to live in racially homogeneous communities and are least likely to come into contact with people racially different from themselves. So what difference does it make now? For people of color, living in a hyper-segregated community increases one's exposure to the disadvantages associated with concentrated poverty and reduces access to the benefits associated with affluent communities, regardless of their own socioeconomic status. Sociologists tell us that residential segregation continues to be the structural linchpin in America's system of racial stratification. Racial segregation limits access to the helpful social networks needed for successful employment. Neighbors connect each other or each other's children to employment opportunities and other needed resources. Keeping groups separated means that community helpfulness is not shared across racial lines. Because of residential segregation, economic disadvantage and racial disadvantage are inextricably linked. Acknowledging now what really are centuries-long persistence of residential segregation and its consequence, school segregation, goes a long way towards explaining why the answer to the first question posed to me is still yes. The Black kids are still sitting together. The social context in which students of color and white students enter academic environments together, in those few places where they do, is still a context in which their lived experiences are likely to have been quite different from each other, and in which racial stereotyping is still likely to be an inhibiting factor in their cross-group interactions. That said, isn't anything better? In his commencement address at Howard University on May 7, 2016, our 44th president, Barack Obama, offered an answer to that question. Speaking to a largely Black audience, he highlighted the ways the world has improved since his own college graduation in 1983, including in the area of race relations. Here's a brief excerpt of that speech. In my inaugural address, I remarked that just 60 years earlier, my father might not have been served in a DC restaurant, at least not certain of them. There were no Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, very few Black judges. We're no longer only entertainers. We're producers, studio executives, no longer small business owners. We're CEOs, we're mayors, representatives, presidents of the United States. And of course, President Obama was correct that there has been positive, meaningful social change in our lifetimes, certainly in the years since I was born in 1954. But if we focus specifically on the 20-year period from 1997 to 2017, we must acknowledge some setbacks beyond just the stubborn persistence of neighborhood and school segregation. There are 3 such setbacks I want to highlight here: the anti-affirmative action backlash of the late 20th and early 21st century, the economic collapse of 2008, known as the Great Recession, and the phenomenon known as mass incarceration. The first of these setbacks, the anti-affirmative action backlash of the late 20th and early 21st century, has had significant impact on Black, Hispanic, and Native American access to the best-resourced public colleges and universities. The case of higher education in California is a telling example. I probably don't need to tell this audience, but in 1996, California voters approved an initiative known as Proposition 209, which effectively ended all state-run affirmative action programs. The initiative, which took effect in 1998, had a devastating effect on the enrollment of Black, Latino, and Native students at the 2 leading public universities, UCLA and UC Berkeley, with enrollment dropping precipitously after Prop 209. The sharp decrease has led to a greater sense of isolation for those students that do enroll. A similar impact was seen in Michigan following the passage of its own version of Proposition 209 in 2006. The California and Michigan flagship institutions have found that without taking race in consideration, it's very difficult to achieve representative levels of diversity across the higher education landscape, despite the demographic changes of the 21st century. Recognition of that difficulty seemed to play a role in the most recent Supreme Court decision regarding affirmative action programs. As you may recall, in June 2016, the court ruled on the case of Abigail Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin, in which UT Austin's use of race as one factor among many in a holistic review of applicants was being challenged. To the surprise of many court watchers, the Supreme Court ruled on the side of the university. Writing the majority opinion for the court, Justice Anthony Kennedy praised Texas for having offered a reasoned, principled explanation of its policy, but also warned that the court's decision, quote, does not necessarily mean the university may rely on that same policy without refinement in the future, reminding us all of the still unsteady ground on which current affirmative action programs stand. The second setback, the economic collapse of 2008, shook the ground of many, but had a disproportionately disastrous effect for many Black and Latino families. Not only did many families of color lose their homes, they also lost their jobs in the Great Recession. Disparate unemployment rates continue despite the national economic recovery. The racial wealth gap between whites and people of color is the highest it has been in 25 years. The economic disparities translate into educational disparities as well. College access is much more difficult when families have had little opportunity to accumulate savings and have no real estate assets against which to borrow. According to the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, the percentage of Black students whose families had nothing to contribute to their college education, or what those of us in the business would say, an expected family contribution of 0, went from almost 42% in 2008 to 60% in 2012. For the Black elites that President Obama mentioned in his Howard University commencement speech, the last 20 years may have represented an improvement in their economic circumstance, but for the vast majority of Black and Latino families, it's been a downward slide. It's worth noting that some white families have been sliding downward as well. The number of white families with an expected family contribution of 0 went from approximately 19% in 2008 to 29% in 2012. The poverty rate among working class whites has grown from 3% to 11% since 2000. The gap between white and Black poverty has narrowed during that time, not because Black people are doing better, but because whites in that sector of the economy have been doing worse, fueling both economic anxiety and anger, clearly visible among some of the white voters supporting Donald Trump's candidacy in the 2016 presidential election. The third setback of the late 20th century and nearly 2 decades of the 21st that we must acknowledge is the impact of mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, writes the following: "More Black men are imprisoned today than at any other moment in our nation's history. More are disenfranchised today than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote based on race. Young Black men today may be just as likely to suffer discrimination in employment, housing, public benefits, and jury service as a Black man in the Jim Crow era, discrimination that is perfectly legal because it is based on one's criminal record. This is the new normal, the new racial equilibrium," end quote. And while Alexander highlights the plight of Black men, similarly disturbing statistics exist for Black women. Though many more men are in prison than women, the growth rate for female imprisonment between 1980 and 2014 exceeds that for men by more than 50%. This dramatic increase in incarceration is not due to a rising crime rate. Rather, it can be traced back directly to changes in drug sentencing laws and policies in the 1980s. Since the official beginning of the war on drugs during the Reagan administration, the number of Americans incarcerated for drug offenses skyrocketed from 41,000 in 1980 to nearly 500,000 in 2014. Most of these people have no record of violent offenses and are not major players in the drug trade. In her award-winning book, White Rage, historian Carol Anderson describes the implementation of these policies as part of a repeating pattern of white assertion of social control following periods of Black social gains. These statistics are depressing, and perhaps you are asking yourself, as I ask myself, surely something has changed for the better in the last 20 years. And indeed, if there's one thing that might suggest there was a positive change in race relations in the 21st century, it might be the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Think back to election night 2008. I spent that evening with hundreds of students gathered at Spelman College to await the results of that historic presidential election. When the announcement of then Senator Barack Obama's victory came, the cheers and tears and the swell of the largely African-American crowd at Spelman were mirrored in the faces captured by the news broadcasters at the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational gatherings in places like Grant Park in Chicago, Times Square in New York, and at the gates of the White House in Washington. Surely it was a night to remember. According to a USA Today poll taken immediately after the 2008 election, 67% of Americans expressed pride in the racial progress the election represented, even if they did not vote for Barack Obama themselves. Yet 27% of the poll respondents said the results of the election frightened them. Some of that fear could have been related to disagreement with Obama's policies or related concerns. But for some, the fear might have been related to an unvoiced and maybe even unconscious recognition that the racial calculus of our society was being changed by the election, a change that could threaten the racial hierarchy of the nation. As a psychologist, I know that a shifting paradigm can generate anxiety, even psychological threat, for those who feel the basic assumptions of society changing in ways they can no longer predict. Certainly, the election of 2008 and the re-election of President Obama in 2012 challenged a fundamental social narrative in American culture. History tells us that social change is hard and often resisted. To the extent that the election of Barack Obama disrupted the usual narrative of white victory, it represented unpredictability, and lack of predictability creates anxiety. And during the last 20 years, we've seen the level of anxiety rise in our nation. Why? It's not just the election of a black president. It's the 2008 collapse of the American economy. It's terrorist attacks on our own soil. It's the slow recognition that other countries are gaining on U.S. global prominence. Maybe, especially for white people, it's the growing sense of being outnumbered in what was once a 90% white nation. Each of these societal changes represents a challenge to a set of assumptions deeply held by many in our nation, and anxiety, even fear, is the result. And how do we as human beings deal with fear? Not unlike other animals, typically we either withdraw or attack. In the aftermath of the 2008 election, we could see evidence of both patterns. The withdrawal takes the form of hunkering down, pulling in and pulling away from those we feel threatened by. When we are afraid, we quickly begin to categorize who is for us and who is against us. We start to think and act in terms of us and them. We withdraw into our circles of safety, and we attack those we believe are outside that circle and who pose a threat. Such behavior can help explain why there has been a sharp rise in hate groups and in racially and ethnically motivated hate crimes since the year 2008. Indeed, according to a New York Times report, Stormfront.org, America's most popular online white supremacist site, saw the biggest single increase in membership in its history on November 5th, 2008, the day after President Obama was elected. Perhaps more surprising, 64% of the registered Stormfront users are under the age of 30. Which brings me to the myth of the colorblind millennial. One of the young users of such internet hate sites was 21-year-old Dylan Roof, charged with the 2015 murder of 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina. Following that horrific shooting, I read an NPR report by Gene Demby entitled Dylan Roof and the Stubborn Myth of the Colorblind Millennial. The story opens with these lines. The young age of Dylan Roof, who's charged with sitting alongside 9 black churchgoers for an hour before standing up and shooting them dead, is sure to inspire some head-scratching in the wake of his attack. He's 21, which means he's a millennial, which means he's not supposed to be racist, So the thinking, stubbornly, if disingenuously, persists, despite ample research showing that it's just not true. Denby continues by citing the results of an MTV survey of young viewers regarding their racial attitudes. That 2014 survey of a nationally representative group of 1,000 14 to 24-year-olds gives us an in-depth look at how the millennial generation thinks about issues related to bias. Among the key findings one of the key findings was that there is a widespread belief, 91% of this population believe in equality. That's good news, and the idea that everyone should be treated equally. A corollary to that belief is that one should not acknowledge racial differences, with 48% believing it's wrong to draw attention to someone's race, even if you're doing so in a positive way. 72% believe that their generation is more egalitarian than previous generations, and 58% believe that racism will become less and less of an issue as they take on leadership roles in our society. For 62% of them, electing a Black president in 2008 was evidence that race is no longer a barrier to opportunity for people of color. White respondents and respondents of color, however, reported significantly different life experiences. White respondents, for example, rarely reported feeling excluded at school or work because of race or ethnicity. Only 10% said they ever felt that, while 23% of respondents of color said they often felt excluded in those settings. Approximately 1 in 8, 13% white respondents said they had been treated differently by a teacher because of their race, as compared to 1 in 3, or 33%, of the respondents of color. Only 19% of whites reported that they were often asked about their ethnic background, while 60% respondents of color indicated that this was a common experience for them. Only slightly more than 1 in 4 white respondents said that they had been seriously affected by the cumulative effect of microaggressions, as compared to nearly half of the respondents of color. Despite the fact that white respondents reported fewer negative experiences with bias, and 41% agreed with this statement, "I think that I have more advantages than people of other races." Surprisingly, almost half, 48%, also agreed with this statement. Today, discrimination against white people has become as big a problem as discrimination against racial minority groups. Only 27% of the respondents of color shared that perception. Almost twice as many white millennial respondents, 41%, agreed that, quote, "the government pays too much attention to the problems of racial minority groups," than did respondents of color. 21% agreed with that statement. Despite these highlighted differences in experience and attitude, almost all millennials surveyed, 94%, reported having seen examples of bias, defined by the survey as treating someone differently and often unfairly because they are a member of a particular group. Yet just 20% indicated that they were comfortable having a conversation about bias. Most, 73%, think we should talk openly about bias and that doing so would lead to prejudice reduction. But like many adults, they are hesitant to speak up. For 79% of them, their biggest concern about addressing bias is the risk of creating a conflict or making the situation worse. For me, one of the main conclusions from this study is that neither my generation nor theirs is living in a post-racial, colorblind society. Instead, we may be living in a color-silent society where we have learned to avoid talking about racial difference. But even if we refrain from mentioning race, the evidence is clear that we still notice racial categories and our behaviors are guided by what we notice. Those biases manifest themselves in ways that matter: who we offer help to in an emergency, who we decide to hire, who we give a warning to instead of a ticket, or who we shoot at instead of issuing a warning during a police encounter. Indeed, it's the latter example, police shootings and their aftermath, that has been the most glaring evidence that we are not living in a post-racial world. There are too many individual examples to talk about here, and you know what they are. Let me just say that the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, in the summer of 2014 seemed to be a tipping point. The activism that followed, not just on the ground in Ferguson, but around the nation and on college campuses, linked by the social media-based movement #BlackLivesMatter, has awakened a new generation to the power of social protest. And if Ferguson was the epicenter of the new civil rights era known as the Black Lives Matter movement, the University of Missouri in Columbia, known as Mizzou, became the most visible symbol for campus-based student activism in the fall of 2015. Certainly, to observers of higher education, the speed with which the events unfolded at Mizzou, culminating in the resignation of the two top campus leaders, was breathtaking, as was the wave of activism that swept across campuses in solidarity with students at Mizzou and in protest of their own campus concerns about racism and other social justice issues. Social media played a crucial role in that proliferation, and indeed, a new website, thedemands.org, was created to compile the growing list of institutions with a link to the student demands on each campus, providing templates for student leaders as they drafted their own campus versions. The website creators declared on the homepage of their website, "Across the nation, students have risen up to demand an end to systemic and structural racism on campus." Higher education researchers who analyzed the demands across various institutions concluded these students are petitioning institutions to consider expansive shifts to institutional culture rather than merely standalone programs or add-on policies. The demands are calling for a change in how marginalized student groups access, experience, and are represented in higher education. And college presidents are responding. In a January 2016 anonymous online survey of college presidents conducted by the ACE Center for Policy Research and Strategy, of the almost 600 presidents that responded, more than half indicated that addressing racial climate on campus had become a higher priority for them as compared to 3 years ago. But not everyone is sympathetic to the cause of the student protesters at Mizzou and elsewhere. The pushback has come from all corners, from fellow students, from faculty, from administrators, from alumni, from trustees, from state legislators, people who say the students are overreacting or whining or need to just get over it. Often, though, not always, those critics are white. Failure to empathize with the outrage of Ferguson protesters in the streets or the sense of isolation or threat students of color report around the country may be due in large part to the racially insulated lives many white people lead, the result of persistent school and residential segregation. According to a 2013 American Values Survey conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, the social networks of white people in the United States are very homogeneous. Indeed, the PRI researchers found that 75% of whites have entirely white social networks without any minority presence. This degree of social network racial homogeneity is significantly higher than among Black Americans or Hispanic Americans. Robert Jones, the CEO of PRRI, writes, "The chief obstacle to having an intelligent or even intelligible conversation across the racial divide is that, on average, white Americans talk mostly to other white people. The result is that most whites are not socially positioned to understand the experiences of people of color with the police or on predominantly white campuses because they are not part of their social networks." Perhaps because so much of the national media attention has been on the lethal encounters between Black people and police, especially since Ferguson, the national conversation about race, to the extent that it has occurred, has been focused on anti-Black racism. It is, however, the case that other communities are experiencing similar concerns. In fact, lethal police violence is not just a problem for Black communities. When compared to their percentage of the US population, natives were more likely to be killed by police than any other group, including African Americans. Analysis of CDC data from 1999 to 2014 shows that Native Americans are 3.1 times more likely to be killed by police than white Americans. In the same way that the problem of police violence extends beyond African Americans to other marginalized populations of color, so too does the problem of isolation and marginalization on historically white campuses extend beyond Black students to other underrepresented groups. What cuts across the experiences of all marginalized groups on college campuses is the phenomenon known as microaggressions. Psychologist Daryl Wing Su defines the term in this way: the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. Often involving the projection of stereotypes, these microaggressions can occur at any moment of the day, which makes them a constant potential source of stress. When Michael Luo, a Chinese-American journalist, experienced one of those moments walking with his family after church on a Sunday morning in October 2016, he posted this message on Twitter: "Well-dressed woman on Upper East Side, annoyed by our stroller, yells, 'Go back to China, go back to your effing country.' Hashtag, this is 2016. In another tweet he wrote, "Now my 7-year-old, distressed by what happened, keeps asking, why did she say go back to China? We're not from China." Later, Luo wrote an open letter to the woman who told my family to go back to China, and to his surprise, the New York Times published it on the front page. "Dear Madam," it began, "maybe I should have let it go, turned the other cheek, but I was honestly stunned when you yelled at us from down the block, 'Go back to China.' I hesitated for a second and then sprinted to confront you. You pulled out your iPhone and threatened to call the cops. It was comical in retrospect. You might have been charged instead, especially after I walked away and you screamed, 'Go back to your fucking country.' I was born in this country," I yelled back. "It felt silly, but how else to prove I belonged? Maybe you don't know this, but the insults you hurled at my family get to the heart of the Asian American experience. It's this persistent sense of otherness that a lot of us struggle with every day, that no matter what we do, how successful we are, what friends we make, we don't belong. We're foreign. We're not American." In response to his initial tweets and then to his open letter, Luo received a torrent of responses from other Asian Americans who shared similar experiences online. Here's just a sample of those he received. "This has also happened to me outside my own apartment building. A woman walked right up to me and told me to go back to my own country. I couldn't even believe it, and for people who say they're just words, guess what? Words hurt. And I went home and cried that day, even though I didn't deserve to feel sad for being American." Luo captured in his open letter the challenge that microaggressions pose to the recipients. The persistent sense of otherness that he describes takes a psychological and physiological toll. Social science research has demonstrated that the cumulative effect of microaggressions assail the self-esteem of recipients, produce anger and frustration, deplete psychic energy, lower feelings of subjective well-being and worthiness, produce physical health problems, shorten life expectancy, and deny minority populations equal access and opportunity in education, employment, and healthcare, end quote. Which brings me, unfortunately, to the election of 2016. There is very little I can say about this election that you have not already heard, but there are 2 points I want to highlight. One, it became clear that Donald Trump's campaign gave new mainstream visibility to a movement that for many years had been in the shadows of American life. What is sometimes referred to as the alternative right, shortened to alt-right, is defined by the Southern Poverty Law Center as, quote, "a set of far-right ideologies, groups, and individuals whose core belief is that white identity is under attack by multicultural forces using political correctness and social justice to undermine white people and their civilization," end quote. Those who identify with the alt-right are characterized by heavy use of social media and their embrace of white supremacist nationalism as a fundamental value. Much of their rhetoric is, quote, "explicitly racist, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-feminist," end quote. Jonathan Greenblatt, the national director of the Anti-Defamation League, speaks for many when he says he is troubled by what he calls the mainstreaming of these really offensive ideas. He says it's allowed some of the worst ideas into the public conversation in ways we haven't seen anything like in recent memory. The second point is that voting patterns revealed a nation divided along racial lines. Put simply, the majority of white voters chose Trump, the majority of voters of color did not. During the course of the campaign, there was a lot of discussion among political pundits about the fact that Trump was appealing to a non-college educated working class base that was feeling left behind by globalism and the loss of manufacturing jobs in the US. And indeed, college graduates backed Clinton over Trump 52% to 43%, while the majority of voters without a college degree voted for Trump 52% to 44%. But among white voters, race seemed to carry more sway than education. More white voters, irrespective of whether they had a college education, voted for Trump. 62% of white women without college degrees voted for Trump, as did 45% of white women with college degrees. While perhaps not everyone who voted for Donald Trump shared the bigoted views of his white supremacist supporters or agreed with the offensive statements he himself made about Mexicans, Muslims, inner-city Black and Latino communities, or women, on Election Day, those things did not prevent millions of people of saying yes to Trump. And that is a painful reality for those who have been his target. So now we are living in the age of Trump. And what does that mean for race relations? We know that Donald Trump's election victory emboldened white nationalists who celebrated his victory in public gatherings, including in the nation's capital. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate-motivated incidents, released a report called 10 Days After, documenting almost 900 reports of harassment and intimidation from across the nation in the first 10 days after the election. In these documented accounts from across the nation, every state is represented. Many of the harassers invoked Trump's name during assaults, making it clear that the outbreak of hate stemmed in large part from his electoral success. The most common occurrences involved hateful graffiti and verbal harassment, although a small number of the reports included violent physical interactions. The Southern Poverty Law Center reports that schools, K-12 settings, and colleges have been the most common venues for these incidents. In such a time as this, we know leadership matters. How the leader describes who is in and who is out matters on a college campus, and it matters in our nation. When I listened to the polarizing rhetoric of radio and TV commentators during the long 2016 election campaign season, full of us-them language, I was reminded of a book I read a few years ago, Left to Tell, by Immaculée Ilibagiza, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. She wrote about the hostile rhetoric that was on the radio airways before and during the genocide, demonizing the ethnic minority to which she belonged. That rhetoric was made especially powerful because it came from the country's leaders. I do not mean to suggest that what we are seeing in the US today is on par with what was happening in Rwanda, but I do want to make clear that what we say matters, and leadership matters. The expectations and values of the leaders can change the tone of the community and the nature of our conversation. Fundamentally, we know that human beings are social animals, and not unlike other social animals, we follow the leader. Yes, we have an innate tendency to think in us and them categories, but we look to the leader to help us know who the us is and who the them is. The leader can define who is in and who is out. The leader can draw the circle narrowly or widely. When the leader draws the circle in an exclusionary way with the rhetoric of hostility, the sense of threat among the followers is heightened. When the rhetoric is expansive and inclusionary, the threat is reduced. It sounds simple, but we know it's not. The leader has to ask the question, how is the circle being drawn? Who is inside of it? Who is outside it? And what can I do to make the circle bigger? As Martin Luther King once said, we are caught in a web of mutuality, and that means our collective fate is intertwined. We will thrive or fail together. And here's what we must also consider. If a person is 20 years old in 2017, born in 1997, the year my book was published, all the critical issues I have identified thus far are the coming-of-age hallmarks for that generation. I was born in 1954 in segregated Florida and raised in Massachusetts as part of the Great Migration out of the Jim Crow South. I and others of my baby boomer generation have a long personal history with social progress. I saw Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on television in real time. I heard his and other speeches and watched the March on Washington on the nightly news. I saw people who had been denied the right to vote exercise that right for the first time on television. I have seen the colleges and universities at which I was educated get more diverse over time. That sense of racial progress is part of my generation's lived experience. Yet for those born in 1997, all of that is something in their history books. Their perspective is shaped by a very different set of events. If you were born in 1997, you were 11 when the economy collapsed, perhaps bringing new economic anxiety into your family. You were still 11 when Barack Obama was elected. You heard that we were now in a post-racial society, and his election was the proof. Yet your neighborhoods and schools were likely still quite segregated. And in 2012, when you were 15, a young black teenager named Trayvon Martin, walking home in his father's mostly white neighborhood with his bag of iced tea and Skittles, was murdered and his killer went free. When you were 17, Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, and his body was left uncovered in the streets for hours, like a piece of roadkill. And in the same year, unarmed Eric Garner was strangled to death by police, repeatedly gasping, "I can't breathe," on cell phone video that went viral. To name just a few examples of why it seemed Black lives did not matter, even in the age of Obama. When you were 19, Donald J. Trump was elected, and white supremacists were celebrating in the streets. How would that 20-year-old answer the question posed to me, is it better? The answer to that question will probably depend a great deal on the social identities of that 20-year-old. In 2017, 20 years after I first wrote my book, how we see ourselves and each other is still being shaped by racial categories and the stereotypes attached to them. The patterns of behavior I described then still ring true because our social context still reinforces racial hierarchies and still limits our opportunities for genuinely mutual, equitable, and affirming relationships in neighborhoods, in classrooms, or in the workplace. So what do we need to do on our campuses? I know that this is a potentially depressing talk. Let me just say, I know that. I want to draw it to a close with at least a little hope to move us in a positive direction. And I'm going to end by sharing two examples before we go to questions. Last April, a year ago, I was in Texas speaking on the campus of Texas A&M, and by coincidence, the week before I arrived, there had been a racial incident. A group of black teenagers from a high school in Houston were touring the campus, and during the tour, they were approached by a small group of students who yelled racial slurs at them. And you might say, what's hopeful about that? Nothing. But what gave me hope is what happened next. The student body president, a young white man named Joseph Benino, class of 2016, issued a statement on YouTube, just 3.5 minutes long, but clear, concise, and courageous, acknowledging that he himself had been silent in the face of racist and sexist remarks, often made behind closed doors. He recognized that his and others' silence gave permission for the hateful remarks to be made publicly. He said, "Our silence fosters hate. Our silence enables the hateful to feel comfortable and welcome." He urged his fellow students to take responsibility for making a change. I was very impressed with his statement, and you can watch it yourself on YouTube. Just type in the statement of the Texas A&M student body president, and you will find it. But his example of leadership was, for me, a sign of hope. I don't doubt that an incident of that kind might have occurred 20 years ago, but I don't think the student body president would have put out a message on YouTube in response. The second is what every campus could be doing, and that's creating campus dialogue groups. In October, I visited with my friend and colleague David Shom and some students from the University of Michigan Community Scholars Program. a model living and learning residential community that has cross-group dialogue at its center. As part of the residential experience, the students take a seminar together and participate in various structured dialogues in the residence hall. Intentionally multiracial in its composition, the participating students, both white and of color, who choose the Community Scholars Program as their housing option, spoke eloquently about how much they had gained from the program in just the few months of their first year at Michigan. The students are deeply engaged with each other, learning how to talk with one another about hard topics rather than talking past one another or avoiding interaction altogether. In the fall 2016, before the election, white supremacist posters with explicitly anti-Black content were put up around the U of M campus, creating a hostile environment for Black students who were feeling under attack. One young African-American woman, still in her first year, said, "It's hard to focus on your schoolwork when there's so much hateful stuff. It's hard to know who to trust. It takes energy to reach out to whites without knowing if they are safe." The Michigan Community Scholars Program helps with that. A white woman in her cohort was quick to second that, even though as a white student she is not the target of hateful rhetoric. She said, "MCSP is the only place where I've constantly felt supported, listened to, and understood." When we get it right, it makes a difference. Research shows that when schools and communities are truly integrated with real opportunities for students of different racial backgrounds to take the same classes, participate in clubs and sports together, and collaborate on projects, they make more friends across racial lines and express more positive views than other students do. As adults, they are more likely to live and work in diverse settings, more likely to be civically engaged, more likely to vote. In my view, that is what better looks like. Is it better? Not yet. It could be. It's up to us to make sure that it is. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions. I am working on a project that involves people's frequently asked questions about race or racism in the United States. And so I would be very interested to know what your frequently asked question is. It doesn't have to be related to my talk at all, but if you would fill out a question, you can leave it anonymously, no names required. I would appreciate it if you would identify yourself demographically. For example, you could put your age or describe yourself otherwise, but it would be useful for me to know if different kinds of people have different questions. So thank you very much for considering participating in my frequently asked questions project.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm concerned about voting rights and racism in America today.
Yeah.
Voter ID law and cross-check and many other forms of racial discrimination are rampant. And for those people in this room who didn't vote, you had an opportunity to vote. Many people in America, and 11% of Americans, did not have the correct voter ID even though they were registered to vote, because it costs them too much money and it's a new form of poll tax. Yeah. I'd love your comments.
I'm happy to make comments, and let me just say I write about this in the upcoming version of my book. I didn't include it in my talk for the time constraints, but let me just say, you know, one of the things that is very clear is that the 2008 election and 2012, the Obama election, was made possible because of high voter turnout in communities of color. And since that time, there has been a concerted effort to suppress the voting, particularly of communities of color. That has been well documented in articles in The Nation and elsewhere, and it's really a great concern to me. I think people should be paying a great deal of attention to this. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm a little depressed, so I'm just going to go lighthearted. If you saw Get Out, what did you think of it? And just to make it a little more serious, maybe something about the role of popular culture or movies. Can they do any of the good work that we might hope they can do?
Well, let me just say, if you haven't seen the movie Get Out, you should go see it. And I have seen the movie, and I'm going to tell you something about myself, which is I do not like scary movies. And so I didn't go see it for a long time. I kept reading all these reviews, and I was so intrigued by the reviews I read, I decided that even though it was described as a, quote, horror movie, I would go see it anyway. When I saw it, I would not describe it as a horror movie. I would describe it as a psychological thriller, but I saw it as a real I don't want to say too much about it because it will spoil it for people who haven't yet seen it, but I thought it was, an allegory for colonialism. I thought it was, there are many ways that you could think about that in terms of the ways in which the things that people of color have been taken from them.
Hi, I've gone to a bunch of discussions on diversity, and something I've noticed is that a lot of times when people are identifying themselves, they'll say that they find certain identifiers offensive. So, for example, I've seen people say that they find the word Hispanic offensive, and then similarly that they find Latino offensive. So, and then there was recently an article in the New York Times saying that a bunch of people feel that to say communities of color is problematic. And so I was wondering how you can balance trying to respect people's opinions about what people like to be called with just trying to, in general, foster discussion.
Yes. Well, I think it's really important to ask people what they like to be called, but what your question makes clear is that not everyone has the same answer, right? And it does vary regionally. And this is something I think a lot about because I'm trying to describe things in my book that's going to be read in lots of different places, right? And so I have had the experience of being in some places where, for example, the language of preference to describe indigenous people, American Indian. Other communities, not. And so in writing, I've tried to talk about the fact that different terms are used in different places, and in some cases, I try to use them interchangeably, which perhaps makes nobody happy, but, you do your best. But in the context of dealing with any person in a one-on-one kind of conversation, I think it's always appropriate to ask them what terms they prefer.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time and sharing both your work and your expertise with us on an urgent issue. I'm curious as if you, in your experience, as well as your life's work and research in psychology, can reveal any insights you might have regarding the frameworks and lenses that people enact as they navigate these conversations and these issues that kind of trigger fear maybe that keep them from seeing this as a priority in an increased era of schools that have testing and schools that need funding and teachers that are stretched thin and parents that are stretched with different priorities and needs like hunger for their kids. Is there anything that you can, in your research and your work, that reveals anything about the psychology needed to combat that and to flip that around for us?
I'm not sure I can answer it briefly. So if I'm understanding your question, in a world in which there are many competing problems, how do you get people to talk about issues of race? Is that, in essence, of what you're asking?
Yeah, and is there something that you've researched in psychology that can reveal why that is, why that's not a priority, and how we
Sure, yeah.
people to make it
Well,
one?
let me just say, a lot of my writing is about why it's hard to talk about race, right? And so one of the things that I would say is that it's harder for some people than others, right? Some of us grow up in families where conversations about race take place with some regularity as a young person, but that's not true for everyone, right? So I'm going to speak for myself as someone who grew up, young African-American, growing up in an African-American family. I would say that I grew up in a family where there was a lot of conversation about current events, but not so much about racism per se. My mother would have seen that as an unpleasant topic and would have preferred not to talk about it, right? But in other families, it would be a more common conversation. In white families, if you grew up in a family of activists, maybe you're having that conversation a lot, but in my experience teaching white students, a lot of them will say, we never talked about this in my family growing up. And if you ask people to think about their early race-related memories, most people will have one. We don't have enough time to do this here, but I often ask people to name, think about an early race-related memory. On your way out, you can be thinking this. Think of an early race-related memory. How old were you, right? And many people will identify a school age, 5, 6, 7, and then ask what feeling is attached to it. And many people will identify an uncomfortable feeling. Anger, fear, embarrassment, shame, it could be curiosity or affection, but often it's something more uncomfortable. And then ask, did you talk to anyone about that? And what you'll often hear is no. And if you think about 5- and 6-year-olds, they usually tell you if they've got something weird going on with them, right? They let you know. And so the fact that so many people have an early memory that they didn't feel they could talk to anybody about just speaks to me to how early we learn we're not supposed to talk about it. And that is part of the challenge of trying to, get past all those years of don't talk about it. And even in that data that I cited you from that MTV survey, all those young people saying, bias is a problem, I've witnessed it, but, close to 80% saying, I don't want to talk about it.